My name is Sarah Price. I was heading to the airport and was already late when I stopped at the house. I only stopped here because my boss, Arturo, insisted. I never liked meeting clients. I always thought it was a mistake. I prefer to just do my job with a detached and emotionless attitude. I don't want to know clients or goals. It makes my job easier. This way I can refrain from forming opinions on matters and remain professional. Helen Harris came to the door. I asked who she was, and when she confirmed her identity, I sent her to get a document confirming her identity. When she returned, I, unfortunately, had already formed an opinion about her. "I'm Sarah Price, Mrs. Harris," I said. "I work for the Arturo Rios agency. Here is a recording of the last week of calls and messages from your husband's cell phone." The woman standing in front of me just nodded. "Anything interesting?" she asked. "Time is running out. You people need to reveal something, otherwise I will demand that all my damn money be returned to me." I heard a man's voice from the other room, and she thanked me and closed the door. As I walked back to the car, I again wondered why I was doing this job. The woman today was one of the reasons I like to avoid meeting clients. There was no doubt this woman was the lowest grade of scum. Helen Harris appeared to be in her late 30s, but could be older or younger. She was wearing a thin robe and nothing underneath. I really wished she would have taken the time to look at herself in the mirror before coming to the door because her face looked like she had just had sex, and the smell of sex was overwhelming in the house. The male voice from the other room calling or ordering her to get your ass back couldn't have been her husband's because he was currently in Detroit at some kind of auto supplier conference. I knew this because he was my intended target. I was given the case because the current operatives couldn't find anything, and Arturo didn't want to lose the case. Based on the question she asked, Mrs. Harris seemed to believe that her husband was cheating on her. She was obviously cheating on him, so I just didn't understand her actions. Why don't they just get a divorce and move on? Of course, I was sure it was because of the money. Somehow these couples all started out with great love and always ended up fighting over money. After several years in this job, it's no surprise that I didn't date again. I got to the point where I could tell, looking at the guy, what his quirks were and how our relationship would end. I just didn't believe in love anymore. I thought about this a lot while waiting for my plane to be announced at the airport after check-in. I have no illusions about myself. I am beautiful. I'm not bragging. I'm just stating a fact. I was lucky to be born with a set of traits that men like. I also have a well-built body which men also seem to like. I just consider myself an ordinary girl. I can't blame it if men's thoughts are constantly focused on sex. In fact, when it comes to men, a girl really doesn't have to be attractive to attract them. But if she is beautiful, it only adds fuel to the fire. When I boarded the plane, I noticed a guy 2 rows over stood up and sat next to me. "Hello," he said slyly. "The weather is great for flying." I looked up at him and answered him politely in the most cheerful tone I could muster. "What is your name?" I asked, opening my laptop. "Frank Compton," he said, smiling and showing a row of yellow teeth. I quickly entered his name into the database used by private investigators. Then I turned the screen and showed him his dossier. He looked shocked to see all his personal information so easily accessible. "First of all, Frank," I said, "I don't give a damn about the weather, so your skills as an amateur weather forecaster are wasted here. Secondly, I'm not interested in pleasant conversation or making new acquaintances, so send your fat, balding, beer belly ass back to your original seat, or I'll call your wife Gladys and arrange for you to have divorce papers waiting for you as soon as the plane lands. Any questions?" For a fat guy, Frank could really move fast. He muttered, "Gay girl," and was already in his place faster than I could close the laptop. I opened my briefcase and looked at the photo of Chris Harris. According to my information, he was only 28 years old. He was 10 years younger than his wife. My first impression upon seeing his photograph was that he looked quite attractive. Reading the dossier, I realized that all my first impressions were wrong. Before I even looked at the file, I was sure he was cheating on his wife. I guess I came to this conclusion because she was the one who hired us to get evidence of his infidelity. Looking at the photo and looking through the file, I saw a young, good-looking man with an older, less attractive woman. I was sure that he married her for her money, but after taking a closer look at their finances, I realized that he was the one who supported her. She had no money and did not work. Then I thought maybe there was some accident and he married her for the baby. They didn't have children, so that was out of the question. This case became more and more interesting as it progressed. A couple of hours later, when the plane began to descend, I still couldn't get the image out of my head. He was tall and handsome. He was also only a few months older than me. Why would he associate himself with this woman? She was 10 years older than him. She was short and plump. Her ass was too big, and her breasts were too small. It definitely couldn't be because of her character. And on top of that, she was promiscuous. It just didn't make sense. I checked into my room at the Westin in Detroit. The hotel was part of the Renaissance Center in downtown Detroit. Luckily, the convention was being held less than a mile away at a convention center called Cobo Hall. I was sure that my target would not be happy being in the Renaissance Center. It was GM headquarters, and he was supposedly a big fan of Mustangs. The room was nice, as are hotel rooms in general, but I've been in so many over the years that the details started to get mixed up. I'm also so rarely home for significant periods of time that I really don't remember many details of my apartment. I called the Chicago office to let them know I had arrived. Carla, our office manager and Arturo's wife, answered the phone. "Hi, Sarah," she said. "How's Motown?" "Just like every other crumbling industrial city," I said. "Noisy, aggressive, and full of ego." "Carl is really ready to hand over the case to you," she said. "His wife is due any moment. Daryl will stay and help you. He knows you're in charge." "Good luck, Sarah." "Carla, there's something strange about this case," I told her. Carla, in addition to being a colleague, was my friend. "Sarah, there's something strange about them all." She laughed. After I hung up, I brushed my long, honey blonde hair back away from my face and dressed in a very conservative skirt suit. The jacket and skirt were tan, which went well with my hair. The skirt was below the knees, so it was very suitable for a business setting. It was also tight enough to show off the curves of my ass well. The silk blouse I wore under my jacket had large gaps between the buttons so that my lace bra could be seen if my viewer was looking for it. I grabbed my laptop and headed to Cobo Hall. My laptop and cell phone both had very powerful digital camera capabilities, so if I had caught Mr. Harris behaving inappropriately at a convention, it could have ended overnight. I entered the large hall and put on the visitor badge that Arturo bought for me. It was easy for me to blend in with the crowd by posing as a distributor or buyer, just like my target. Of course, he didn't have to worry about finding one specific person among thousands of people like I did. And he also didn't have to constantly brush off men who spent all their time looking at his ass or chest. I walked around, seemingly interested in the displays of various automotive component manufacturers. I pretended to be very interested in some of the exhibits, although in fact, I was even more convinced that the men were crazy. I think I'm more in tune with reality than the average woman, but I was confused. Why would someone rip a perfectly good and adequately functioning exhaust system off a car only to install another system that looked exactly the same but sounded different, usually louder? Who cares what the exhaust system sounds or looks like? Cars should simply get you from one place to another, with all your luggage safe and sound and without breaking down. The rest of what these people bought and sold was pure nonsense. I was thinking about this concept when I saw it. It seems funny, but the first thing I thought was that he looked even better in person. The photos I had already made me think he looked good, but seeing him in person only confirmed that. There was also something different about looking at a real flesh and blood person as opposed to a photograph. Sometimes people don't look as good as their photographic images, like when you look at some supermodels. In photographs or on TV, they seem like some kind of almost alien, supernatural beauties, but then in person they turn out to be just tired Brazilian women with an underbite, a big nose, and attitude problems. Chris Harris was on the opposite end of the spectrum. He looked even better in person. He was more muscular than I expected, but not in that bulky gym jock way. He also moved with an efficiency that was almost ballet-like. Watching him make his way through the slow-moving people as he visited the different exhibits was amazing. Here and there, he lingered and talked to someone at the stand. He would often take notes and promise to return to a particular booth or product that interested him. Although following people without their knowledge was part of my job, I must admit that following him was difficult. I also almost got caught several times. Part of the difficulty was that he moved so quickly, although it seemed effortless on his part. He seemed to have a different sense of balance and muscle than the rest of us. Several times I almost had to run to catch up with him, or try to find him again when he seemed to disappear into a gap in the crowd of people that I simply could not follow. He would also simply stop and stare at a product or stand that he found surprising or in some way unacceptable. What he did once that really scared me was when he suddenly, without warning, simply turned around mid-stride and walked back to the stand that had barely registered in his mind. When he turned around, he moved so fast that I thought he was going to crash into me. There was really no way to avoid the collision, so I braced myself for impact, only to discover that he had somehow gracefully avoided any contact with me at all. The escape was entirely his fault. I just stood there waiting for the blow, only to find out that it wasn't coming. "Sorry," he offered hesitantly. His sincere but cautious smile made him look shy but friendly at the same time. That same vulnerability he showed by apologizing when he really wasn't wrong was part of his charm. If I had really sat down and thought about how things were going, I would have given up right then and there. Whether I knew it or not, that one word, "sorry," pierced my facade of professional detachment, only I didn't realize it at the time. I was so busy trying to pretend I wasn't interested in him that I didn't realize that I liked him. While I was trying to pretend I was bored at all these events, I noticed that some of the women there were definitely interested in my purpose. Several models on the stands went above and beyond their duties to get his attention. Although this seemed like an encouraging development to me, it soon proved fruitless. On the other hand, it made sense to me in another way. When does a man turn away from the attention of beautiful, well-developed young women? There are only 3 possible scenarios in my understanding. The first theory, that he was gay, was immediately rejected. The second, that he is too busy with work or another obsession, I left for later but did not completely dismiss. The last and most hopeful thing remained, that he was in love. I liked this idea because it made the most sense and could possibly bring the most benefit. If there was any woman with whom he had a relationship, we could tell the wife about it and get our payment. But then she would be keen for us to get details and information, perhaps evidence about the relationship, etc. This would bring us even more money. He had been extremely careful to keep it hidden until now, as some of our best operatives had yet to find anything. But now, I took charge, and the game began. It was corny, but a song started playing in my head. "Private eyes, they're watching you. They see your every move. They're watching you, watching you, watching you, private eyes. Chris." I have to admit I was thinking that afternoon how much I hated being away from Helen. I loved car shows. Although they were part of my job, the only thing I enjoyed more were car shows. The only thing that would make it better is if Helen would come with me to the shows. At the beginning of our marriage, she did just that. I smiled, remembering her then. She was slimmer then, but I was the same. I still remember my jealousy when guys looked at her butt in tight jeans. I still love her ass, and probably always will. Even when she's 99 and I'm 89, I'll still spank her on that bottom. I was like a kid in a candy store as usual, but I had to divide my attention. On the one hand, there were many suppliers with whom I would like to cooperate. My company sent me to several of these events every year to generate new business. There were several companies whose products we already distributed, and several more with whom we were considering the possibility of cooperation. On the other hand, I had a list of modifications I was considering for my own Mustang at home, and there were a lot of things I wanted to know more about. Of course, there were many people to see and meet. Some were people I did business with, and others were fellow travelers I either competed with or worked with. I tried to keep all my meetings and dealings with people at these events on a friendly but professional level. This meant that I avoided female models at shows. They were beautiful and shiny and all that, but they just weren't worth my marriage. I still loved Helen deeply after all these years, and I was a firm believer in that old saying, if you can't be with the one you love, keep it in your pants. Plus, at 28, I was an old soul, firmly stuck between boyishness and old man dignity. I had to act smart and not fall for every pretty face that passed by. The same as with cars. Believe it or not, I was still in love with my 2006 Mustang GT. Although Ford changed the body style a bit for 2010, I liked the 2005-2009 models better. I didn't like that they narrowed the front grille and sloped the rear facade. This made the car look like it was exposing its ass for sex. I liked the sequential taillights, so I bought the included kit from American Muscle, and now my taillights flash consistently the same way. The same philosophy applied when I thought about women. Helen already knew how to do whatever I liked in the rare moments when she was in the mood. Why spend all my time trying to accustom a new woman when I already have a very good one whom I have always loved? When I walked around the room for the first hour, I was so excited that I almost collided with another customer. She was truly beautiful, with beautiful eyes and long honey blonde hair. I turned sharply and walked around her as clumsily as a damn Clydesdale, trying to avoid colliding with her. She probably thought I was as clumsy as a baby foal. I apologized to her, but she was not impressed with my apology. I could tell by the way she just stared at me and then walked away. I hope I don't have to deal with her company because the first impression she must have of me doesn't inspire confidence in my abilities. After a couple of hours of walking around, I already had a good idea of where everything was and the location of all the stands I would like to visit. Some places I will visit for business reasons, and others for personal interests. Perhaps tomorrow I will begin the process of visiting every booth I would like to do business with. I sat down at a table in the food court area to relax and have a snack. I was lucky and got the last free table. The organizers must have seriously underestimated the number of participants. There were a lot of people around looking for a table. I wouldn't mind sharing. You never know who you might meet at these events. Some guy who asked to share my table could be my next big client. "Do you mind if I sit at your table?" someone asked behind me. "Of course not," I replied, not even knowing who it was. I turned around to look at the person I was about to sit with and learned that it was the woman I almost crashed into. My face instantly turned red. She sat down opposite me and put her laptop on the table. "Thank you," she said cheerfully. "There are too many people and not enough tables." I nodded optionally. I wasn't going to get involved in a conversation with her. However, she was truly beautiful. But unlike the models and girls at the auto shows here, she didn't try to use it to her advantage. Just as our conversation was about to move on to something more serious, two female models I had seen earlier came to our table and just sat down. They didn't even bother to ask permission to join us. They just sat down. They are probably used to everyone prostrating themselves before them. They completely ignored my companion and didn't bother to introduce themselves. They just started talking to me. My companion suddenly seemed engrossed in something on her laptop. I used one of my tried-and-true techniques to politely let women know that I wasn't interested in them. When answering their questions, I was very careful with my words and used my hands to support my answers. Most women would have noticed my wedding ring, which I practically stuck in their nose, but not these two. Since they clearly had no manners, I resorted to my usual backup plan. I just got up and left, saying I needed to call my wife. They continued talking as I left, addressing my disinterested companion. Sarah. When I sat down at the table next to Chris, I had a plan in mind. I knew that most men would throw themselves at me with little incentive. If I could get him to do something to me, depending on how far it went, it could be over quickly. However, it really depended on how far things went, because I'm not a girl of easy virtue and would never lie with a guy for the sake of business. However, despite my permission to sit at his table, he did not initiate further conversation. He seemed content to just look at the handful of pamphlets he had already collected. My pride took a hit. I was ready to step up my actions when the need for this was no longer necessary. Two obviously interested models approached the table and began talking to him. They didn't even bother to ask if we were together. They also left me out of the conversation completely. I turned on my laptop camera and started recording their conversation. I was sure that these two would be able to provoke some kind of reaction from him. Both girls were very beautiful. The youngest of them was in her early to mid-20s. She had very long, very light blonde hair and green eyes. She had large, obviously artificial breasts and the breath of a little girl. She had to be at least 5'11", and still probably weighed less than me. My ego really took a hit today. If this girl doesn't seduce him, then her friend probably will. The other woman was older, perhaps in her early 30s. She was also Latina, also very beautiful. But while her friend looked like a typical airhead, this woman was the epitome of class. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into one long ponytail. Her breasts were small and perky, but they fit her body perfectly. However, she had a butt that could baffle even Jennifer Lopez. I couldn't have won any category with those two. They did their best to engage him in conversation. His replies took a long time to arrive and were very short, monosyllabic comments. Most people would take this as a hint that he doesn't want to talk and leave him alone. The two, however, didn't even consider that he might not be interested, so he increased his defensive measures. It was almost painful to watch as he began to punctuate all his answers with hand gestures that clearly showed off his large wedding ring. It was as if he was shouting, "Leave me alone! I'm married!" Naturally, the two either didn't notice what he was trying to say or simply didn't care. I have come across some women who prey on married men. Married men are much less likely to cause a scene or cause problems because they have too much at stake. After a few minutes, I could see the frustration building up in him, so he suddenly stood up and left the table after telling the two idiots that he needed to call his wife. After he left, they finally noticed that I was nearby. "Hey, you two don't know each other, right?" asked the blonde. "We were just sharing a table," I replied. "Okay," the brunette said. I somehow had my eye on that one. "Why?" I laughed. "Aren't they all the same?" "Actually, yes," she said. "But I go to a dozen of these events a year. I see a lot of guys who come and go. Most of them start looking for women as soon as they get there. They also inflate their positions and importance when it's too easy to verify. This is the 4th time I see him at events like this, and not once have I seen him act unprofessionally or inappropriately. He is also highly respected among the suppliers and the companies they represent. He does business with integrity, and, as far as I know, he is on track for a major promotion in his company. Of course, the fact that he is married poses a problem, but it is not an insurmountable obstacle. I actually like that he's loyal to her. It means he'll be just as loyal to me." I had to laugh at her confidence. "What makes you think you can win him over?" I asked. "Just look at me, darling," she said. "I can have any man I like without any effort." She looked at me directly with coldness in her eyes. "And when I have him, I will do for him whatever he wants. Whatever he wants. I will never let him leave." I didn't know what to feel looking at her. Was she simply telling me her intentions? Or did she think I might threaten her plans? On some level, I felt threatened by her too. But I didn't know why. If she were successful in her endeavor, it would actually help me. All I had to do was follow her and record them together. Then I would have the necessary evidence. But something told me that it would not be in my interests to cooperate with her. "Well, I just think he's cute, and I'm going to sleep with him for the rest of this convention," the blonde interjected. "Mara, you can marry him and have 40 children with him after I'm done with him." For some reason, I started to get angry. Luckily, my cell phone rang and interrupted the call. "Sarah, meet me at the snack stand," Daryl said. "5 minutes," I said into the phone, then ended the call. "Well, good luck, ladies," I said, gathering my things and preparing to leave. "Who needs luck when you have this?" the blonde said, cupping her chest. Behind us, a man dropped his tray of food, slipped on it, and fell, and another guy crashed into a pole and nearly lost consciousness. "See what I mean?" the blonde smirked. "Not a bad distance, Amy," the brunette said. I walked into this showroom knowing that I was above average in attractiveness, but next to these two, I felt like a boy. A few minutes later, Daryl came up to me, pretending to show me the brochure. Daryl is African American, so seeing us together was quite noticeable. "I have a plan for our goal," Daryl said. "It's a little tricky, but I'm desperate." "Daryl, I have to lead," I said. "You should have consulted me." He looked at me like a repentant schoolboy. Daryl was one of my best friends. He was very smart and had a degree in criminal justice. "Sorry," he said. "I'm not trying to step on your toes, but we planned this before you were assigned to the case. We've been tracking this guy for 3 weeks and haven't found anything yet." I knew from previous experience that Daryl was very good at his job, perhaps even too good. He tends to get emotionally involved in things. His involvement did not involve him getting to know the objects or having any feelings about them. Its flaw was that it never failed to deliver results on purpose. In his mind, he had a perfect record, and he didn't want to see it ruined. "What do you have planned?" I asked. Daryl quickly told me the plan. According to the target's schedule, he was supposed to attend a video presentation hosted by American Muscle. Afterwards, he will return to his hotel for a while, and then return for the convention opening dinner. The dinner also includes dancing with live music. Daryl lined up not 1, but 4 prostitutes to meet Chris at either a video presentation or a dinner. If at least one of them manages to put him in a compromising position, the case will be closed. "Okay, this sounds a little like cheating, Daryl, but let's try it," I said. It was funny that even though I agreed to the plan, deep down I didn't think it would work. After observing his behavior with 2 models, my subconscious formed an opinion about Chris Harris. Unfortunately, my subconscious was not communicating with my professional, rational consciousness. My subconscious, also known as my heart, was telling me that the plan wouldn't work because Chris Harris wasn't a cheater. This was also the reason why Daryl and Carl had not been able to find a single shred of evidence in almost a month. An hour later, I found the American Muscle booth and looked around for Chris. He sat very close to the front in the second row. I started talking to one of the men who was walking around wearing American Muscle polo shirts. I correctly assumed that since he was wearing a company t-shirt, he was helping organize the presentation. After promising to have drinks with him at dinner later and hinting that there might be something else after dinner, he seated me in the front row, which was reserved for American Muscle employees. I didn't want to sit next to Chris again so soon. Too many chance encounters too quickly would alert him to the fact that these were not just coincidences. It will be much better. Sitting in the row ahead of him, he would have no choice but to see me. On the other hand, I will pretend that I don't notice him at all. This way, I will still impress him without doing anything at all. I could hardly wait for the show to start. And I wasn't thinking about the American Muscle presentation. Almost as if by script, a slender woman with dark hair entered the presentation area. She looked around and slowly walked towards Chris. She looked around and finally, very hesitantly, asked him if the seat next to him was occupied. I couldn't hear his answer, but he looked around to see if there were any empty seats anywhere else. She was good, really good. She sat down, but not in the seat next to him. She left an empty space between them, but to make sure no one would separate them, she quickly placed her purse in the space between them. This exchange also allowed me to learn more about my goal. It's clear that Chris Harris didn't even realize how attractive he was. Most men would be happy that so many women are paying attention to them. Chris wondered why she wanted to sit next to him when there were so many empty seats. The woman, who was one of the easy girls Daryl had hired, began trying to strike up a conversation with Chris. I'm excited. I knew Daryl was behind them and filming their interaction. I turned around and pretended to be looking at something on stage. I was actually turning my ear to hear their conversation clearly. The girl asked Chris about the company and their products and what they could expect to see. Chris pretended not to hear her and looked around as if trying to figure out who she might be talking to. She tried to approach him from the other side. She told him it was her first convention, so she didn't know what to expect. Chris actually lied to her. He said he didn't know anything about the company either, so she should just watch the show and find out for herself. He buried his head in the brochure, hoping it would stop the talking. But then a disaster occurred. I watched as Mara and Amy entered the auditorium and walked straight towards Chris. They didn't even try to be subtle about their intentions. They simply walked up to the row where he was sitting, and Mara sat down in the empty chair to his right. Amy moved to sit on the chair to his left, where the easily accessible girl had placed her purse, but she didn't allow it. She shifted her bag and sat down on the chair herself. The bimbettes failed to separate Chris from the pataskuka. Chris quickly stood up and Mara grabbed his arm, trying to sit him back down. "Honey, where are you going?" Mara asked. Her slight accent gave her words an exotic edge. I don't know you," Chris muttered. "Of course you know. We are old friends. You sat with us in the food court," Amy said as she stood up. The appearance of the women alone attracted the attention of everyone present. As Chris quickly stood up and began to walk away, every eye in the room was on him. He looked around, blushing with embarrassment, and our eyes met. At that moment, time stopped, and I felt sympathy for him. In the background, that damn song started playing in my head again. "I see you and you see me. I watch you cross boundaries when you make a scene. Oh, girl, you should know. What my mind misses, my feelings will show my heart. When I'm waiting for lies, you cannot hide from my private eyes. They are watching you. They see your every move." I've been doing private investigations for quite some time. I've gotten to the point where I can tell when someone is lying, or even when they're hiding something. At that moment, I was divided. On the one hand, as a professional, I was intrigued by the situation and the opportunity to learn more about my goal. My rational and professional brain told me to observe everyone involved in the situation, see how they all react and compare their actions to their motives, or what I knew about their motives. The bimbettes wanted Chris. They slowly tried to pull him into their net. They would use every chance for contact. Even a situation as disastrous as this could be used for their ultimate purpose. Even though this seemingly failed, it gave them two advantages. First, it ensured that he would pay attention to them again. The more contact they had, the better it worked in their favor. Secondly, it gave them the opportunity for further contact. The next time they see him, they will simply walk up to him and apologize for embarrassing him. As an added benefit, they were able to disrupt whatever plans the easily accessible girl had for him. Although she was not in the best position, they found that she was ineffective. An easily accessible girl tried to save her earnings. Of course, she would get a few dollars for trying, but she would get $500 if she could get into his hotel room, and even more if she could actually get him into bed. On the other hand, my heart felt like I had just shot a puppy. In the end, it was very close to what I did. I took a man who I knew deep down was trying not to cheat on his wife and threw him to the sharks. If I had any professional ethical principles, I just violated them. There's a big difference between watching someone cheat on their partner and getting evidence of it, and what we just did. We were really trying to create a situation of betrayal. We had crossed the line, and now I had to watch how it would turn against us. Chris just said, "Excuse me, please." Then, using his incredible agility and flexibility, he stepped over the back of the chair in front of him and walked away. For a moment our eyes met again, and he looked away. I felt even worse. He wanted to see the presentation in person, so I made him skip it. Chris. I returned to my hotel room. I was really mad about missing the American Muscle presentation, not only because they were already a customer of ours, and I wanted to look at their new stuff, but because they were my favorite aftermarket supplier for my black '06 Mustang GT. Something strange was happening. The same two rude women from the food court were there. If I didn't know better, I would have thought they were following me. Perhaps I accidentally did something that offended them, and they wanted to humiliate me to get revenge. I tried calling Helen at home. When I was really down, her voice always made me feel better. However, lately she always seemed irritated. I seriously thought she was going through menopause early. It was starting to seem like our decision to hold off on having kids until I found a job where I wouldn't have to travel so much might not be such a good one. It didn't matter that much to me, though. I wanted to have children, but I couldn't live without Helen. Why are you calling me? Helen barked into the phone. I just needed to hear your voice, I said. There are some strange people here. I'm not having the best time. What do you expect me to do? She asked. Drop everything I'm doing and fly to Detroit to support you? Damn, Chris, you're a grown man. I can't do everything. Marriage involves partnership. Do your part. I'm busy right now. Goodbye. I love you, Helen, I said into the phone. I then changed into long-running shorts and a tank top. I took my iPod and went to the hotel gym. I love running and usually prefer to run outside, but I was in a strange city and didn't know the area, so I decided to take the easy way out. I found a treadmill along the wall and stood on it. I set the speed to a comfortable but challenging tempo and lost myself in the music. Sarah. After Chris left the presentation, I also realized that I had nothing more to do there. The guy from American Muscle, whom I had charmed earlier, seemed offended that I was leaving before their presentation began. What about later? He asked in a whining voice. Honey, as much as I dream about having sex with you, I said, it can't be later. I'm doing this to protect you. Protect me from what? He asked. My husband, I whispered. He's very jealous and looks like he followed me here. I winked at Daryl, and he stood up and walked towards us. He'll come now, I said. I saw the guy's eyes get bigger as Daryl approached. Before Daryl got close to us, the guy disappeared. Let's get out of here, I laughed at Daryl. Daryl and I went back to my hotel room to talk and plan. Daryl was probably the most polite person I knew. He stood shyly at the door to my room, and I walked around grabbing things until I noticed him standing there. Daryl, can you sit down? I said. Well, it went very badly, he said. I really think our girl had a chance at it until the other two bitches came along. Believe it or not, the other two were not professionals, I said. Dark-haired Latina thinks she'll be his next wife. What about the volleyball player? He asked. Her name is Amy, and she just wants to get him into bed before her friend marries him, I replied. Well, I still think our plan has a chance of success, he said. Our chances would have been even better if those two hadn't shown up at dinner. They probably won't be there, I said. The dinner is for customers, not salespeople. Therefore, we must have a clear perspective. Daryl's phone rang, and he answered. It was Arturo checking us out. Daryl told him what was going on and relayed the news from home. Carl's wife went into labor as soon as he returned. It was as if the baby was waiting to be born until his or her dad witnessed it. When Daryl relayed this information to me, I had a strange thought. I wondered if I would ever get married and have my own husband and children. As soon as this thought came into my head, I threw it away. From the very beginning of this case, very strange thoughts came to me. Daryl, what do you think about this case? I asked him. It's fucking weird, he said. Even though this guy is damn cunning, I'll tell him that. I'm not sure he's any more cunning than the guy we caught who screwed his kid's teacher. But sooner or later, they always make mistakes. Sooner or later, we'll kick his ass. I am sure about that. Daryl, why are you so sure he's cheating? I asked. Oh my gosh, Daryl said. Listen to this. He showed me footage of Chris calling his wife at home after leaving the presentation. Daryl thought it was funny as hell. He kept playing the last part over and over again. I love you, Helen. Suddenly, I got angry. I have never felt more angry or sad in my life. Shut up, Daryl! I screamed. There were several moments of silence between us. Then I sighed and apologized to my friend. Did I do something wrong? Daryl asked. I'm sorry, Dee. It's not about you. It's about me. I have a feeling we're the bad guys this time, I said. What do you mean? He asked. Sarah, we are not good guys or bad guys. All we do is observe and collect evidence. Our subjects are judged by their own actions. They would still be just as guilty if we weren't there. What are we doing? D brings resolution to difficult situations. I've heard that damn speech from Arturo more times than I can remember. Daryl, what if the reason you can't get any evidence against this guy is because he really isn't cheating? I asked. You said we were only observing. If we were police, we were planting and targeting available women on him in the hope that he would sleep with one of them. That would be called provocation, wouldn't it? He nodded his head. I think we've gone beyond surveillance and are now trying to make this guy do something he's not, and that makes us the bad guys, I said. But he must be cheating, Daryl said. He just has to have something on his side. There is no other explanation for this. No explanation for what? I asked. For taking all that crap from your wife, Daryl snapped. She treats him like hell and he just savors it. I nodded and Daryl continued. Have you seen his wife? Daryl asked. I nodded again. She's older than him, she doesn't work, she has no money other than what he gives her, and she's not very attractive, I said. Not very attractive, Daryl repeated. That bitch looks like Frodo Baggins. She's cheating on him too, I said. Daryl was shocked. Why the hell should he put up with all this? Daryl asked. You heard that on Phone D, I said sadly. He loves her. We see her as a lazy, freeloading, unfaithful, ugly dog. But he loves her. Let's discuss this tonight and tomorrow. And if we don't come up with something by then, we'll have to talk to Arturo, I said. Daryl nodded in agreement. Daryl went back to his room, leaving me to get ready for dinner. For the first time in my life, I questioned both my work and my path. Over the past 4 years, I have seen many marriages fall apart. Ironically, I have seen some become stronger because of infidelity, and we brought honesty and closure to many bad situations. It was the first time I actually felt bad about something I did. Plus, I saw so many men, and just as many selfish schemers just having sex with their spouses and significant others that I was practically living the life of a nun. What good did it do me to start dating a guy when, as soon as I found out his name, I did background checks and learned everything about him and his past before he even told me about it? Any little white lie they told to bolster themselves was mine. Besides, I was almost a human lie detector, and as soon as the man told me even the slightest lie, I was like, they stank of shit. Damn it, no one will ever take advantage of me. But where did this lead me? Nowhere, and that's a fact. You know those sad old ladies who walk down the street all day and then come home to a lonely house with only a TV and a 3-legged cat for company? I was just like them, only I didn't even have a damn cat. I felt like I was at a crossroads in my life. If I did something wrong here, I'd better start visiting animal shelters to find my companion. Daryl got a great job as a dinner waiter. This would allow him to go anywhere in the room and hide cameras to film Chris's bad behavior. Daryl remained professional and decisive, but although I would never admit it, I was sure Chris wouldn't do anything. A small part of me was on his side. I stayed at this damn dinner for almost 4 hours. Chris didn't show up for the entire first hour. I was sure he was very nervous coming to it after the scene at the presentation earlier. When he finally arrived, he was clearly not as cheerful as when he first arrived at the exhibition. He spoke with several of his business contacts and even ate at the table with several of them. I couldn't help but notice that many of the sparkles in his eyes had disappeared. I didn't know how to explain this. A missed presentation, or the bad behavior of his wife. All 3 of our girls failed. After dinner, several ladies asked him to dance. In each case, he politely refused, showing them his wedding ring. I thought that maybe it was also a case that he just couldn't dance. But I was wrong about this too. The daughter of one of his clients, who couldn't have been older than 12 or 13, stood up as a new song was playing. She held out her hand in front of Chris, and they headed to the dance floor. The man definitely knew how to dance. When they returned and sat down, Chris received several more offers, but again took refuge behind his ring. Why the hell can't I find someone like him? I wondered. Soon after, he left for the evening. I felt even worse. Daryl pointed out that there was a man at the dance who seemed very interested in me. At first, I thought it was the guy from American Muscle, but Daryl told me it wasn't him. Maybe he just loves you, Daryl said. Believe it or not, you are an attractive woman. I just smiled and wondered if Chris thought I was attractive. Helen, can you believe the audacity of this bastard? I exclaimed. How dare he interrupt me with his petty nonsense? Where did we stop? Robert pointed to himself. I slowly walked towards him and knelt down. I began to pleasure him slowly and lovingly. Then we have MSK, passionate sex. Oh, baby, that was good, he muttered. He stepped away from me towards the bathroom. Your wife doesn't do this for you, does she, baby? I said. I would never let her, he said roughly, because I love her, and she's not an easy girl. I fell silent again. Robert, we need to talk, I said. Even as I tried to figure out how to begin what I wanted to say to him, his words got through to me. He said, I love her. Didn't he love me? He also said, she's not a slut. Is this how he sees me? Bobby, I'm pregnant, I said, watching his reaction. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Are you trying to tell me that we can't have sex anymore because you and your husband are getting a puppy? Okay, then this will be our last time. It hasn't been that much fun lately anyway. Honestly, Helen, you're getting a little old. It's time you started thinking with your head and not in one place. Having a baby will definitely make your little hubby happy. Robert, this is not his child. This is yours, I screamed. Oh no, it's not like that, you stupid bitch, he shouted at me. There's no way you're going to get me attached to you. You need to solve this problem today. I'm not going to risk my marriage over an old bitch. So you need to work this shit out. Don't call me until you figure it out. This. He practically ran out of my house, grabbing his clothes along the way. I sat on the floor in shock. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard her. Hello? She said. Is anyone here? Some matron of Latin American appearance was standing in my living room. She saw me on the floor and ran up to me. Mrs. Harris, she asked. I nodded my head woodenly. Are you okay? She asked. I shook my head. I thought things would never be okay again. I really screwed up, I told her. I spent the next few minutes letting out all my problems. She listened and never tried to judge me. I even told her about some of the things I did for Robert. I explained my past with Robert to her as well. Even before I married my current husband, I knew Robert. My first husband died serving in the army. While he was fighting in the Persian Gulf, I cheated on him with Robert. Then, when my husband was killed, my guilt caused me to stop seeing Robert. A few years later, I was remarried and just beginning to forget the past. Thanks in part to the boundless love Chris always showed me, Robert reappeared. Chris always treated me much better than I deserved. He's younger than me, and he kind of puts me on a pedestal. He literally gives me everything I ask for. I think I have some deep-rooted issues because, while it feels good to be lifted up on high and worshipped, sometimes I just need to be brought down and taken down hard. I thought Robert loved me too. In fact, all my plans were built around Robert and I both getting divorced and moving in together to raise our child. Now, I see that my plan will not come true. In fact, this leaves me in a very bad position. Maybe your husband won't know the baby isn't his, she said. Chris has a very rare blood type, I told her. Every time we go to our hospital, they beg him to donate. Sooner or later, it will come out. She shook her head. The stupidest thing about all of this is that I love being Chris's wife, I said. I love how caring he is and how he loves me unconditionally. I also love how all these stupid young women throw themselves at him when they have no chance of having him. Robert was never supposed to replace Chris. He was supposed to complement him. I think I wanted my loving husband whenever I wanted, but I also wanted to have an evil, mean bastard on the side, I told the woman. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew the baby was Robert's. I really wanted it to be the other way around. Chris would have been the perfect father, but the timing wasn't right. I started treating Chris badly because how much he loves me, I know he won't stand for it. Chris is the sweetest, calmest man in the world, but he won't share his woman or his car with anyone. I started planning our divorce a few weeks ago. Robert told me that Chris was probably cheating on me while he was on the road, so I hired an agency to keep an eye on him. My lawyer told me that in the event of a divorce, especially if there is a child not from Chris, but conceived during our marriage, I probably won't come out very well on that. The woman simply looked at me and shook her head. Well, normally what I'm about to tell you would be considered good news, she said. But in your case, I'm sorry, but it won't be. Listen to this. She played me another day of Chris's calls and a log of his activities at the convention so far. They even went so far as to hire easily accessible girls to try and lure him. He even refused to dance with other women. "Your husband is not cheating on you," she said. The most painful blow, of course, was our telephone conversation yesterday. At the time I was talking to him, I was so busy getting back to having sex with Robert that I didn't notice how emotionally drained my own husband was. I felt even worse after I heard him tell me he loved me after I hung up on him. Sarah. This morning, when I got out of bed, I realized that I could no longer work on this case. I called Arturo and told him to send someone else to support Daryl. I packed all my things and planned to leave for home as soon as my replacement arrived. Don't ask me why I did it. I still don't know what motivated me, but I needed to see Chris one more time before I walked off into the sunset. I went to the convention center for breakfast. I saw Amy and Mara preparing their booth before most of the participants arrived. I walked through the buffet line and grabbed myself a cup of coffee and French toast. I sat down at the table and my timing was perfect. I took the last free small table. A few minutes later, Chris entered. I noticed Amy's eyes fall on him as soon as he entered the great hall. She must have some kind of radar for sensing men, I thought. Chris took his food and started looking for a place to sit. I stood up and called him to my table. "I still owe you a place," I said. He just smiled shyly in response and moved to sit opposite me. "Sit here next to me," I said. He just stood there and didn't move. "I know you're married, but don't worry. So am I lied. I waved, and Daryl walked over. "This is my husband, Daryl," I said. They shook hands, and Chris sat down as Daryl went back to his business. Once Chris saw that he was in relatively safe hands, he relaxed a little and we had a great conversation. We talked about a lot of things, including the insane amount of affection some people have for their cars. Chris even showed me too many pictures of his Mustang at home. I noticed that the Bimbettes weren't happy about the fact that Chris and I were talking. To hell with them, I thought. But they were the least of my problems. Chris just finished telling me how he and his wife Helen met. She was his nanny when he was growing up, and he fell in love with her, and he never stopped loving her. She got married and her husband died in the army or something like that. Chris pulled her out of her depression and made her live again. A few years later, he asked her to marry him, and she categorically refused due to the age difference. He kept asking her every day until she finally agreed. Then I realized that he really loved Helen. He only talked to me about her because he thought we had something in common. What he thought we had was that we were both in unconventional marriages. He was married to a woman who looked much older than him, and he thought I was married to a black guy. My heart sank in pain again. Then I realized two things. The first was that from the very first moment I saw this man, everything I did was a lie and deception towards him. He didn't deserve this. I pride myself on my ability to tell when people are lying to me, so shouldn't I try to be honest myself? The second thing I realized was that somehow, over the past few days, I had fallen in love with this man. My revelation was interrupted by screams. "You are a mean, lying, cheap, heartless, treacherous bitch," he shouted. I turned my head away from Chris and turned towards the source of the noise. It was the guy who looked at me at the party last night. He was talking about me. He rushed at me and almost hit me. I fell over the chair. Daryl jumped at the guy, but it seemed like the guy was expecting it. He hit Daryl in the face with a metal chair. Daryl fell and did not move. I was on the floor, tangled in a chair, trying to get my stun gun out of my bag. The guy stood over me, seething with anger. He pulled his hand back to hit me. There was so much focus on me in his eyes that I could tell that, whatever his beef with me, he wanted to kill me. The shock of what was happening dulled my senses, and I am not ashamed to admit that I was scared. When he pulled that big fist back, about to crush me with it, I may have peed my panties a little. Daryl was just starting to get up, but even if he stood up, he wouldn't have time to help if he could get up. Someone was shouting about calling security. I'm sure they would be of great help. I tried to get ready and crawl away, but the fist began to descend. Out of reflex, I closed my eyes and stepped back from the expected blow, but it never came. I opened one eye and then the other when I heard a slap just as the blow was about to come. Chris stood over me and caught the blow in his hand. He reached out and placed his forearm into the man's elbow joint, and somehow, using a judo or wrestling technique, twisted the guy's arm around his forearm. Suddenly, the guy just fell to the ground. It was some kind of lock on the joint. I had to sleep through this self-defense class. "Calm down," Chris told the man. "There is never a reason to hit a woman." "She is not a woman," said the man. "She's a cold, soulless bitch who took my wife and kids away from me." The man simply collapsed and began to cry like a child. I tried to remember his face, and he suddenly became familiar to me. "Everything will be fine," Chris said. "Don't believe a word this bitch tells you," the man said. "She pretends she wants to be with you, but really she's some kind of private investigator. My wife hired her to catch me cheating. I lost everything in the divorce. I only see my kids once a year." The guards finally gained control of the man and took him away. "Thank you," I said to Chris. "Is it true what he said?" he asked. He looked at me differently. I could tell that even though we had only spent the last hour or so talking together, he was remembering every time we met or were around each other. "This is my job," I said. "When people are in love, they are vulnerable. They have doubts. What we do is help them get rid of these doubts. We give them the confidence to give their hearts and their love completely without doubt that the person they love loves them in response. If we can't give them that, we give them evidence to make sure their divorces are fairly easy." He just looked at me. A crowd gathered around us. Everyone in the room was literally looking at us. "What a fool I am," he said. "I know we just met, but I liked you. I thought maybe we could be friends. I've been a little upset lately because Helen doesn't seem to be very happy with me. I was hoping that you could give me some advice to make her love me again. What a sucker I am. She hired you, didn't she?" I nodded slowly. "I wanted to tell you," I said, "but you don't have to worry. Everything in our report will tell her how much you love her. You're pure." Even when they came out, I knew that my words were just words and meant nothing. In fact, they meant less than nothing. The worst part was when he said he liked me. He said he thought we could be friends. He started letting me into his zone of trust, and that bastard ruined everything. The words from that damn song were back in my head. "You play with words, you play with love. You can twist it, baby, it's not enough. 'Cause girl, I'll know. If you let me in or let me go. Don't lie when you're hurting inside. You can run away from my private eyes." The most painful part was clearly the most painful. My heart literally hurt, and I could tell by looking at him that I had broken Chris too. He didn't trust many people anyway, but he was just starting to let me into his circle of trust. Not only did I prove unworthy of trust, I also showed that he could not trust his wife either. And the fact that, despite all his love for her, she still didn't trust him. I was devastated and had no time for jokers. So when I turned and faced the bimbetes, common sense should have warned Amy, but blondes were never known for that. "I thought we made it clear to you yesterday," she told me in a nasal voice. "I guess I don't need to warn you again because you really messed things up with him." She gave me a satisfied smile. She didn't even see the blow I hit her with. She just stood up, staggering and holding her mouth while her lips were swollen. I grabbed Daryl's hand, trying to wake him up. He was dazed and complaining of neck pain, so I took him to the ER. "Chris, these few days have been difficult. After the incident at breakfast, when I realized that Sarah was not a real friend, I immediately left and took the first plane home. I realized why Helen had been so dry with me lately. She didn't trust me. Perhaps someone gave her the idea that I was cheating on her. I had to let her know that I have never cheated and never will. I only loved her. And now, I love her more than when I first fell in love with her at the age of 6. I left the airport and got into my favorite black Mustang. I quickly got from the airport to our suburb. The house seemed strange as I walked out of the garage and across my driveway to the door. Before inserting the key into the lock, My neighbor Ricky Ricardo ran up to me. "Chris," he said. It sounded like Cadiz, his thick Cuban accent distorting my name. Ricky was a great musician and band leader, but he was killing the English language. I couldn't understand a word of what he was saying. Luckily for me, his wife Lucy came over and told me that Helen had been taken to hospital. I immediately went there and waited for over an hour while they pumped out her stomach. I had to fill out a bunch of medical forms and explain my location to the medical staff before I was allowed to see her. I just knew that somehow it was my fault that my wife tried to kill herself. I sat by her bed with a lot of questions in my head. Was her suicide attempt because she thought I was cheating on her? Didn't I somehow push her to this? When Helen finally woke up, I learned the whole tragic story from her. Helen still loved me as before, she said, but we had some unresolved issues. The first one was that she heard from her friend that I was cheating on her. Since she is older than me, she believed that I was tired and ready for a younger, fresher woman. I found it ironic that the only woman I ever looked at was the one she hired to follow me. She hired private investigators to find out if I was cheating on her. If I cheated on her, it would destroy her. But she loved me too much not to fight for me. She just wanted to know who she would have to fight against. She would never let me go without a fight. I decided right then and there that nothing would ever separate us. No matter what it is, we will be together. Then there was a more serious problem. The first could simply be seen as a misunderstanding. The second one was much worse. Part of the reason Helen had been acting so strange lately was because she was keeping a secret from me. A few weeks ago, she was raped. She was so ashamed of this that she did not say a word about it to anyone. After a few days, she became depressed and withdrawn into herself. She regretted pulling away from me, but she was so ashamed. She also recently found out she was pregnant and just didn't see a way out of this situation. She was afraid to face me with the news that she was carrying someone else's child, especially when we were putting off having our own children. She saw no way out, so she decided to take her own life. It was a lot to take in a short period of time. I hugged her, telling her that nothing would ever separate us. He also said that I loved her too much to let her leave. We both cried, and I held her until the nurse came and said I could come back the next day, but I needed to go home. The nurse also told me that Helen would have to stay in hospital for another 72 hours for observation and then need to be assessed by a GP before she could be discharged. When I got home, I went inside and sat on the couch. Everything was happening too fast for me to process. Someone knocked on my door. I stood up to answer and saw that it was Lucy Ricardo again. She handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it. She said a woman knocked on her door and asked her to give me an envelope. I thanked her and went back inside. Lucy didn't want to leave. I think her natural curiosity and tendency to get into trouble really made her want to know what was in the envelope. Alone in the living room, I opened the envelope and was shocked like never before, as my world as I knew it collapsed. Inside the envelope was a note of only 13 words. The note was scribbled in pencil so that no one would ever recognize the handwriting. "Don't be a sucker. She's cheating on you. It's his child. She's lying." There were also a couple of terrible photos. One was a close-up of Helen's face. She was naked. The second photo showed Helen and some old man I didn't recognize having sex on my couch. There was also an audio tape of Helen telling another woman the whole story. On my own, I would have dismissed the note. The photographs may have been doctored, but I recognized Helen's voice. And together, all three pieces of evidence were enough to break my heart. I spent the evening curled up on the couch. After a while, I realized that I was lying on the same couch that Helen had sex with that guy on, and I almost threw up. I always thought I would love Helen forever. Deep down, I probably still loved her. But I just couldn't understand what she did to me. I had evidence that she cheated on me. At the same time, she trusted me so little that I was being watched to see if I was cheating. But the worst thing of all was the way she calmly looked me in the eye and lied about everything. I didn't even know if she was actually trying to kill herself. Perhaps she just did it to gain my sympathy so she could tell me her bunch of lies. The next morning, I called my boss and told him that I needed to take the day off to deal with personal issues. Most guys would probably go back to the hospital and throw papers and photos in Helen's face. They would demand to know who this guy was and how long this had been going on. My problem is that I'm just not very confrontational. I was seriously injured, but I just needed to get away from the source of my pain. Seeing Helen in this state would only make things worse. I needed to get away to think about something other than my problems, so I could heal. I know it sounds cowardly, but let's face it, we're all different. This was my way of coping. I signed up for one of those racing courses where you learn how to control your car better. I chose a session that would start in 2 days and hit the road. I didn't really think I needed to learn to drive better. I didn't want to become a racer or anything like that. I just wanted to try something new and take my mind off my life. I called my lawyer from my car and asked him to start filing the divorce papers. I think this is also where I deviated from conventional wisdom. How can a man love a woman so much that he can't breathe without thinking about her one day and then want nothing to do with her the next? It seems impossible. But when this man has been repeatedly deceived in a few short hours and begins to believe that it was all just to hide the fact that the woman he loves thinks he is a fool and does not love him, it becomes quite possible. I knew that I still had very deep feelings for Helen. I also knew that despite her words to the contrary, Helen did not love me. I explained the situation and the photos and the note. I even played part of the recording for him. He expressed his regret to me and agreed to handle it for me. The camp was in Arizona, so I had a lot of time to think while on the road. Just before it got dark, my cell phone rang. I thought it was my lawyer, but it was Helen. This seemed to be the first time she was allowed to make a call. She was allegedly in a panic all day. "Where are you, dear?" she asked. "Helen, maybe you're confusing me with someone," I said coldly. "Maybe you have the wrong number. It's not your dear one, it's just your stupid husband who loved you when he could barely walk." She stopped talking and I could hear her breathing, but she didn't say anything. "I've learned a lot about people in the last few days, Helen. Maybe I'm too gullible or just stupid, but that's in the past," I said. "Please don't call again. I've already given my lawyer instructions on how I want to handle the divorce. I'm giving you until the end of the week to take whatever you want from our house. Then I'll put it up for sale." "Please, Chris, I know I messed up," she said. "We need to talk about this. I think I'm having a midlife crisis or something. I'll go to therapy. This doesn't have to be the end for us. We can get through this. I'll never see Robert again. I'll give the baby up for adoption or whatever you want. Don't leave me, Chris. You can't leave me. You love me." I hung up. She called again 5 minutes later. I looked at the caller ID and saw her number, so I didn't even bother answering. Over the next hour, she left me 14 messages, all of which I deleted without listening. A little later, as I settled into my hotel room for the night, my phone rang again. I recognized the number and quickly picked up the phone. "Hey, Chris, can I sleep over at your place tonight?" she asked. "My home is your home," I said, "until I sell it." "You're not really planning on selling this place, are you?" she asked. "It's so beautiful, and you and her spent so much time and money making it like that." "Too many memories are associated with this place, Jane," I said, "and I'm not even sure how many of them are real." "When will you be back so we can talk?" she asked. "Janie, I'm not even in Illinois right now. I'm about halfway to where I'm going," I said. "So if you want to talk, let's start now." "What really happened between you and my stupid sister?" she asked. "She called me crying. She said you left because of a misunderstanding, and she was so upset that she accidentally took too many sleeping pills." I snorted when I heard her version of events. None of what was said was a complete lie, but it was not the complete truth either. "I know that you will never leave her because of something stupid," Jane said. "You love her too much. For years I was jealous of her because by all rights you should have been mine. You and I are much closer in age and temperament than you and Helen. Of course, the problem is that you spent most of your life following it like a lost puppy. Have you ever dated anyone else?" "No," I replied. "I didn't want anyone else." "Have you ever had sex with anyone else?" she asked. Before I could change the subject, she started laughing. "Jane, Helen cheated on me with some guy named Robert. She's pregnant with his child. I have to move on with my life, so I filed for divorce," I said. "You're not serious," she said. There's no way she could be that stupid. If I knew what this was about, I wouldn't have come here to try to help her. Well, Jane, now you know. You can stay in the house as long as you need. Please take some of Helen's things with you when you go. It will make it easier for her to get ready, I said. Chris, I know what Helen did was wrong. She seriously screwed up, but she really loves you. Are you sure there's no way to forgive her? None that I can see, I said slowly. Good night, Jane. I had barely hung up when it rang again. Damn, I was popular today. I didn't recognize the number. Hello? I said. Chris, where the hell are you? Asked a female voice. Who is this? I asked in response. Your best friend, said the voice. Then I barely heard her say, got it. Then she hung up. I didn't answer any more calls for the rest of the evening. In fact, after 2 more calls from Helen, I turned the ringer off. There was no reason for me to talk to Helen again. We simply had nothing to talk about. I felt like the biggest fool on earth. I loved this woman long before most of my friends were even interested in girls. I actually fell in love with her before I was even interested in girls. When she first started working as my nanny, I thought girls were completely useless and weird. I didn't see the point in being friends with any of them. They couldn't play baseball, couldn't climb trees properly, and were afraid of frogs. What was the point of them? On the other hand, they liked things like dolls and completely stupid games. They were simply useless. The first time Helen came to babysit me was a revelation. There was something about the way she talked to me and showed interest in everything I said. I followed her around like a love-struck puppy and never stopped doing so. She could make me do things just by asking me that my parents couldn't get or had to be threatened into doing. There was nothing I wouldn't do for Helen. On the other hand, there was always a mutual dislike between me and any boy Helen dated. I just couldn't stand another man who wanted my girl. I remember when Helen turned 18 and started dating Jeremy Martin. I was only 8 years old and Helen went into the kitchen to make me a bedtime snack. My parents never spoiled me like that, but Helen always gave me a snack and read me a story before bed. She also sat next to me, held my hand and kissed my forehead and cheeks until I fell asleep. Anyway, while Helen was cooking my Oreos, I went back to the living room to get my favorite toy car. It was, of course, a Mustang. Suddenly, I overheard that creep telling a friend on the phone that as soon as she put the baby to bed, he was going to get her and leave her the next day. He didn't really love her, and she didn't have breasts. He put up with her long enough without getting anything in return. So tonight would be the end, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. I went back to my room, angry. I didn't understand most of what Jeremy was saying, but I didn't like it. When Helen came into my room, we both noticed each other. I noticed that Helen was wearing perfume. I didn't like it because they smelled like flowers, and flowers were as useless to me as girls. I loved Helen's natural scent. Helen looked at me strangely because it was probably the first time she had seen me angry. "Chris, is something wrong?" she asked. "Helen, what are breasts?" I asked. "Chris, you shouldn't say that word," she said softly. "It's not a good word. It's a rude way to talk about a woman's breasts." "What do you mean, get her and throw her?" I asked further. Then Helen was really surprised. "Chris, where did you hear that?" she asked sharply. "That's what Jeremy said to his friend on the phone while you were making me a snack," I said. "Don't worry about stupid Jeremy," she said sharply. "He won't harass anyone here, and we'll see who leaves who." Helen left the room, and a few minutes later, I heard screams and noise coming from my living room. I got out of bed to see what was going on, and when I looked into the room, I saw Jeremy pushing Helen onto the sofa. He unbuckled his belt and stood over her. Of course, now I know what he was going to do, but at the time, my 8-year-old mind thought he was going to try and give my Helen a beating. I became even angrier and grabbed my baseball from the dining room table. I threw a baseball across the room. It was the best fastball I've ever thrown. It hit Jeremy in the back of the head like a missile. He didn't even see it coming. It just folded up like a folding chair. I still remember how Helen hugged me, standing over him, looking menacingly. Before he fully recovered, Helen helped him up and threw him out of the house. From that day on, I was Helen's hero. She always told me that when I grow up, she will marry me. To her, they were just sweet words that she never took seriously, but I believed her every time. I found out many years later that I didn't actually save her from Jeremy. I just put it off. Less than 2 weeks after this, Jeremy actually slept with Helen and then dumped her right after he was done. He also passed it on to several of his friends. This seems to be what started Helen's path to who she became. She had a deep-seated need for a man to abuse her. All the love I felt for her and all the years I dedicated to her meant nothing compared to this. It was an addiction she couldn't break, like a person who quit smoking. Sometimes they don't smoke for more than 10 years, and then a stressful situation sets in and they start smoking again. Either way, I was ready with Helen. She broke my heart, but I'll get through it. She could take half of everything I had, but she couldn't take my pride, and she couldn't take my heart anymore. At the race course, even though I thought I was a great driver, I learned so much that I didn't know. I learned about actually using the gears in my transmission, not just shifting them. I learned different gear shifting techniques. I also learned about choosing the best lines on the track to reduce the distance traveled and improve my car's ability to pass the track. I fell in love with driving my Mustang again. I decided that this would not be a one-time thing. I would come back here more than once. Sarah. I looked at Chris's credit card charges and noticed that he had signed up for a racing school weekend seminar. On the one hand, I was a little afraid for him because, although driver improvement schools are generally safe, there have been a few accidents and even a few deaths reported. I didn't want anything to happen to him. On the other hand, leaving the bitches, including me, who hurt him, would be the best thing that could happen for him. The school he chose was in Arizona. It would take him several days to get there. I called his cell phone and tracked him to find out where he was. All I had to do was get him to pick up the phone. The tracking system will do the rest. When he picked up the phone, I couldn't help but talk to him. "Chris, where are you?" I asked. He asked who I was. He probably didn't recognize my voice. It was understandable since he had only heard it once or twice, but it still hurt. "Your best friend?" I said, hanging up. When Chris arrived at the track the next day, I watched as he pulled into the parking lot and checked in. I already worked as an assistant cook in the only restaurant on the territory. It was an ideal temporary job because it gave me access to all areas of the site, and he would probably visit the restaurant at least twice a day, if not more. He also wouldn't have seen me since I would have been working in the back kitchen. I wore a brunette wig and big glasses, and still guys started hitting on me. I almost lost my job the first time Chris walked into the restaurant. Brandy, the waitress, joined Chris before he even sat down. She wrapped it around her finger like a cheap dress. She rubbed his arm, helping him sit up. She accidentally rubbed her breasts against his shoulder while giving him the menu. She reached across the table, sticking her ass right in his face, to give him a knife and fork. I knew that she always carried cutlery, wrapped in napkins, in her apron pocket. She was smiling like a damn Cheshire cat when she returned to the kitchen. "I'm going to get everything I can out of this guy," she said. "Maybe I'll marry him and have his children." Before Chris walked into that restaurant, I liked Brandy, but she didn't even realize how close she came to being electrocuted and suffocated to death that morning. On the other hand, I laughed out loud when she left a piece of paper with her phone number on his desk and subsequently returned to find it still there. That afternoon, as I watched him drive, my fingernails dug into the bench every time he took a high-speed turn. I realized that I had a serious problem. My original purpose in keeping an eye on Chris was because of my conscience, which told me that I should try to restore the balance in his life that my investigation had destroyed. When I came into his life, he was a really happy, really good guy who loved his wife and believed that she loved him. I helped destroy it. He still had a great job and a good life, but I wanted him to find someone who could replace the love I had helped destroy. This got me thinking, why didn't I want to see him with Brandy? I told myself that I should check on her first. I also told myself that I had to deal with his divorce first. There was no way I was going to let that old witch ruin him. I also have to give credit to Arturo. He could have just fired me. I was about to leave, but he told me that I could just work on my own schedule. I could participate in activities and still do my babysitting job, as he called my supervision of Chris. Years from now, it will pay off for Arturo, but that's another story. Over the years, I have developed relationships with many attorneys in the city. We make mutual referrals. Lawyers often refer a client to a private investigator to help gather evidence for a divorce, and vice versa. Not surprisingly, I knew the lawyer Chris hired. Chris gave that wizened old hobbit far more than he should have just to get rid of her. On the other hand, she fought tooth and nail to stop the divorce or delay it. I have to admit that my behavior was as unconscionable as hers, but I had to save Chris from her. I constantly forced Carla to call her and give her advice that, although it seemed helpful, actually cut into her throat. When she was talking to Carla and telling her that she missed Chris with all her heart and would give anything in the world to have him back, we recorded the conversation. But when she said that one of the reasons she had to get him back was because she would have to get a job and didn't want to work, that conversation was saved and given to Chris's lawyer. Finally, if we lived in an ideal world, everyone would be honest and open. But let's face it, that would be pretty boring, right? It so happened that I knew a court clerk who regularly dated the wife of one of his best friends. I also had photographs of one of these meetings. In exchange for the photos, he assigned Chris and Helen's divorce case to a judge who is known to dislike cheaters. This same judge was known for almost ignoring recommended judicial standards in cases where deception and cunning were off the charts. He himself had once suffered from such a woman, so my poor Chris came to court expecting to lose half his property and left in shock. Left on the judge's bench was a file from an anonymous source that detailed how Helen hired our agency to spy on her husband while she cheated on him. The report even revealed how some operatives tried to provoke Mr. Harris into cheating on Mrs. Harris's request. Her edited conversation with Carla and the original file I sent to Chris were also there. I think Chris noticed me sitting off to the side at the back of the room, wearing the same suit I wore in the restaurant. But I'm not sure if he recognized me. The judge was furious. He was so angry that he entered a divorce decree and gave Chris an incredibly favorable 80-20 division of property, with no alimony and no child support, since the child was not his. Helen suffered a nervous breakdown right in the courtroom. Over the next days, she constantly called and tried to visit Chris until he had to issue a restraining order. She was desperate to get him back and claimed she couldn't live without him. It got so bad that she had to be hospitalized. She was still on Chris's health insurance plan, so he came to see her several times. The first time he was there, he attended one of her therapy sessions. He sat in the back of the room and did not participate in the conversation or comment. He spoke to her briefly in her room. He told her that she needed to forget about him and move on with her life because he was trying to do the same thing. He said he would give her money if she needed it. He also told her to return to Robert. Chris didn't take any action against Robert or his marriage because he didn't want revenge or for anyone to get hurt. He just wanted to move on with his life and be happy again. He told Helen that he had nothing against her and thanked her for all the happy years she had given him. His only regret was that the love he gave her was either not what she needed or was not enough. After that, he left her room. He never intended to see her again, but the next day, he was called again. I made a friend at the clinic where Helen was, so I knew what happened before Chris found out. The window in Helen's room was barred to prevent escape, but there was glass in it. In the summer, large industrial windows were opened for ventilation. One of Helen's windows was broken and would not stay open on its own. A large metal-framed window was held open by a wooden block on one side. A few hours after Chris left her room, Helen rested her neck on the windowsill with her face up. She called the orderly. Several minutes passed before the man working on the floor came into her room. When he entered the room, she calmly said, "There is a note on the table." When the man looked at the table, thinking she wanted him to send her away, Helen smiled at him and said, "Goodbye." She hit the bar that supported the heavy window, and the window closed on her bare neck like a guillotine. It was a sad end for a truly tortured soul. I wish I could say I shed at least one tear for her, but to be honest, I didn't. After the way she treated the man who loved her his whole life, this bitch got what she deserved. As for the note, Chris never received it. It was pure nonsense. I tore it up as soon as I got it and paid the orderly $300 for it. What kind of sick person writes, "Chris, I can no longer live knowing that the person I love no longer loves me. I am leaving for a better world, hoping that sooner or later you will join me, and we can forgive each other and be together forever." It was signed, "Yours, Helen, forever." This bitch was crazier than anyone could imagine, even thinking that I would let Chris read such a letter or ever find out about it. She tried to play on his guilt, hoping that he would do what she did. I couldn't let this happen. 6 months later, Chris began dating, and to my regret, sleeping with Brandy. He went to Arizona every other weekend. When Chris was in town, Brandy was all his. The rest of the time, Brandy slept with whoever she wanted. When Chris returned home one weekend, he received another file from his best friend. The file contained photographs of Brandy having sex with several guys on the new bed he had recently purchased for her trailer. The next and last time Chris came to Arizona, he showed Brandy the photos. She cried and begged him to give her another chance. He told her he would talk to her when he got back to the track. He never returned. Chris began dating a few women occasionally, but seemed unhappy. I almost died of a heart attack when he was dating that bitch Mara from the conference. Luckily for her, they didn't succeed. I have to admit that Chris became depressed, and there was nothing I could do about it. Chris, last night, as I was leaving the office, a large black guy stood in front of me who seemed familiar to me. "Chris, can I talk to you?" he asked. I nodded my head. I didn't have anything else. "Can we sit somewhere for a beer?" he asked, and I nodded again. "Do you still go to Arnold's?" he asked. I nodded a third time. "Meet me there in 10 minutes, he said, and left. I rode my little pony slowly to Arnold's. I was racking my brain, trying to remember where I'd seen this guy before. I entered the bar and looked around. I noticed a guy sitting at a table with a big Latino guy. I joined them. "Chris, first of all, I want to thank you for saving my life 16 months ago. That guy came out of nowhere. If you hadn't stopped him, he could have killed me and Sarah," the man said. "Now I remember you. You're the husband of that annoying detective. Your wife helped ruin my life. If I knew who you were or what you were doing, I probably wouldn't have stopped him," I replied sharply. Both men looked at me and then at each other. Then they laughed. "Yeah, you would have stopped," Daryl said. Both men nodded and took a sip from their beers. I waved to the waitress, who knew me, and she went behind the bar to get my favorite drink. Both men were drinking Corona and looked at me strangely when she placed the bottle in front of me. "I don't always drink beer," I said, "but when I drink, I prefer Dos Equis," after which we all laughed like old friends. "So what's up?" I asked. "It's about Sarah," Daryl said. "She's obsessed, upset, and depressed, and I have to admit, I can't take it anymore." "Well, consider yourself lucky," I snorted. "At least you have a wife to take care of, so she doesn't like it. Are you done ruining people's lives?" "She's upset with you," he said calmly. "Sarah may not admit it, but she's in love with you." "Wow, I haven't seen or talked to your wife since the conference," I said. Both men laughed again. "Of course you didn't," Daryl said. "She's very good at what she does, but she's always been close to you since that day. When you ran off to play with your car in Arizona, she was that dark-haired woman who worked at the restaurant. The same dark-haired woman handed the file to the judge on your divorce. The voice on the phone who claimed to be your best friend. The one who kept giving you files and information about that waitress you slept with in Arizona and everyone else you didn't like in the last 16 months. She basically put her life on hold to keep an eye on you," he said. My jaw dropped, and I took a sip of my beer. "Why is your wife watching me?" I asked in shock. "She is not my wife. I already told you. She loves you," he said. "And you know what else? Remember how well you two got along before that psychopath attacked her? I think you love her too." They both looked at me. I remembered that Sarah was really beautiful, and I really felt guilty the whole time I was talking to her at the conference. Even though we were only talking, I felt like I was cheating on Helen. "So what do you want me to do?" I asked. "Just talk to her. That's all I'm asking for," Daryl said. Sarah Arturo called me on my day off. I was annoyed. I had plans for the day. I needed to review the personnel files of every eligible woman working at Chris's company. I couldn't afford another Mara. Every time I thought about him dating a piece of trash like her, my heart broke. I wanted him to find a good girl, someone he could fall in, love with, and have children with. I knew it would kill me when he finally found someone, but I wanted her to be perfect for him. Arturo told me to get dressed and make myself beautiful again. He was tired of seeing me come to work looking like an old shoe. I took a shower and put on a nice dress. I went to the address Arturo had given me and discovered that I had been to this place before. This was one of Chris's favorite places to hang out. I hoped he wouldn't be here. Arturo met me in the parking lot and gave me a task. I had to keep an eye on a guy who might have been cheating on his girlfriend. I started to object. Arturo knew I didn't do things like that anymore. After Chris, I did insurance fraud or something. "Do this for me, please," Arturo begged. "This guy's a real bastard. He's nothing like your Chris." Why did Arturo call him my Chris? Did everyone think I was in love with him? "Arturo, don't ask me to do this again," I replied sharply. "He's sitting at the third table on the right." Arturo smiled. "Thank you, Sarah. You won't regret this." "I will if Chris gets hurt or gets his heart broken while I follow your bastard," I said. However, I still didn't understand why Arturo smiled so widely when I entered the bar. I took a table and called the waitress. She brought me a glass of white wine, and I sat back in my chair to watch the bastard. He was nervous as he sat at his table. It was exactly the kind of behavior you would expect from a man cheating on his girlfriend. Suddenly, all my instincts fell into place. I was going to have fun pinning that bastard against the wall. It's guys like him who make life hard for good. Guys like my Chris. Did I really say that? I was on a hunt. Now imagine my surprise when suddenly someone played my favorite damn song on the jukebox. I was humming along to the song Private Eyes when it suddenly dawned on me that I had been set up when I got to the third verse. "Why are you trying to put up a facade? I'm a spy, but I'm on your side, you see." I stood up and walked over to the table. When I approached, I saw that the long, greasy hair on his head was a wig, and his big nose and glasses were one of those Groucho Marx masks from the joke shop. I laughed as Daryl Hall and John Oates sang, "Come on in any camouflage. I'll still recognize you by looking into my personal eyes." I took off my mask, revealing Chris's handsome face. "It took you so long to understand," he said. "I thought you were supposed to be some kind of private detective. If I hadn't made them play that damn song, I could have sat here all night." He laughed as he said it. "What are you doing, Sarah?" he asked. "What I've always wanted to do," I said as I kissed him. The kiss was even better than I could have imagined. That kiss told him everything he needed to know about me. I already knew everything there was to know about him. In the end, like every hunt I've ever been on, I caught my quarry. This evening at Arnold's may have marked the end of Private Eyes, but it was only the beginning for Sarah and Chris. We lived happily ever after. But that is another story. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.